The cameras flashed like lightning across the UN Assembly Hall as Donald Trump stood at the podium, his voice echoing through the marble chamber. "America built the world's economy," he thundered, his fingers stabbing the air, "and Africa owes us, in gold, in resources, in loyalty." His words carried arrogance wrapped in patriotism, and the Western delegates nodded in approval. But across the room, Ibrahim Traoré sat still, his eyes locked on Trump like a hawk tracking its prey. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. The room could feel it, a storm was brewing behind his calm expression. Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, had heard this tone before, the colonial echo that turned every deal into debt, every partnership into control. The gold Trump was talking about wasn't just metal, it was the symbol of Africa's stolen centuries. And tonight, he wouldn't let that insult pass unanswered. When Trump finished his speech, reporters swarmed. His face gleamed with the confidence of a man used to winning every room. But as Traoré rose to take his place at the podium, the atmosphere shifted. Silence fell. His presence demanded it. Even the American journalists lowered their microphones, sensing something historic about to unfold. "Mr. Trump," Traoré began, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. "You say you own Africa's gold. That's strange, because I never saw an American mine it, or bleed for it, or die protecting it." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Trump's jaw tightened. "Our gold," Traoré continued, "was taken with chains and blood. And if you want to claim it again," he paused, his gaze sharp enough to slice glass, "then you'd better be ready to pay the price." The hall erupted, gasps, applause, flashes. Trump stood frozen, lips pressed into a scowl. No one had ever spoken to him like that, especially not on the global stage. But Traoré wasn't done. "Africa," he said, "isn't for sale. Not its people, not its land, not its pride." As he stepped away from the microphone, the applause turned into thunder. Reporters shouted questions. Some Western delegates looked furious, others, quietly impressed. Traoré walked past Trump without a glance, leaving him standing beneath the bright UN lights, red-faced, silent, and exposed. That night, the clip of the exchange exploded online. Millions watched as a young African leader challenged the man who once called himself the world's most powerful figure. The hashtag pay the price trended worldwide. But Traoré knew this wasn't just a viral moment, it was a declaration of war, not of weapons, but of wills. The next morning, chaos swept through Washington. Trump's advisors gathered in the Oval Office, visibly shaken by the global reaction. Screens around the room played clips of Traoré's speech on repeat, his calm defiance, his piercing tone, the crowd's thunderous applause. "He embarrassed you, sir," one aide muttered before realizing his mistake. Trump's face hardened. "Embarrassed me?" he barked. "He embarrassed Africa. He doesn't understand power. We built his world." He slammed his hand on the desk. "Find out who's funding him. China? Russia? I want sanctions ready by tonight." While Washington fumed, Ouagadougou burned with pride. In Burkina Faso, millions poured into the streets waving flags, chanting Traoré's name. Children wore shirts that read, "Our gold, our blood, our future." Markets closed early, not for protest, but for celebration. Across Africa, leaders watched, some silently admiring, others secretly afraid. In the presidential palace, Traoré stood on the balcony overlooking the crowd. "They've awoken," he said softly to his chief advisor. "For centuries, we were told to be grateful for our chains. Now they see the truth, we never needed permission to be free." His advisor, Captain Diarra, approached with a document. "Mr. President," he said, "our intelligence confirms what we suspected. American mining companies have doubled their presence in West Africa. They're trying to take control before we nationalize the mines." Traoré studied the report. "They'll move fast," he murmured. "But we'll move faster." He called for an emergency cabinet meeting. Inside the council chamber, the tension was electric. "Gentlemen," Traoré began, "we will no longer export our gold to foreign vaults. Every ounce will stay on African soil. The West calls this rebellion, I call it restoration." Some ministers hesitated. "Mr. President," one warned, "the Americans will retaliate." Traoré looked up from the table, eyes steady. "Let them. Empires fall not when they are attacked, but when they are ignored." News of Burkina Faso's new policy sent shockwaves through global markets. Gold prices spiked. Western journalists called Traoré reckless, dangerous, a populist playing with fire. But in Africa, he was called something else, the man who spoke for the continent. At midnight, as the world argued, Traoré stood alone in his office, staring at a single gold bar on his desk, raw, unrefined, heavy with history. "They say they own it," he whispered. "But this time, it will bury them." By dawn, the White House had already declared economic retaliation. American media outlets framed Traoré as a radical nationalist, a threat to global stability. Sanctions were drafted overnight. U.S. companies were ordered to halt trade with Burkina Faso. The message was clear: obey or be crushed. But Traoré had anticipated this. His intelligence network was already working with neighboring nations, Mali, Niger, Guinea, all ready to follow his lead. "If they want to starve us," Traoré said during a closed meeting, "they'll have to starve the entire continent." Captain Diarra placed a map on the table. "We've secured gold routes across West Africa. The Sahel Alliance is ready to back your plan." Traoré nodded. "Good. Then it's time to show them Africa doesn't need their currency to define our worth." The following week, Traoré held a televised address. The entire continent tuned in. Behind him stood the African Union flag and a display of raw gold bars, unpolished, untouched. "For centuries," he began, "our lands fed their vaults. Our sweat built their empires. And now they demand what was never theirs. We say no more. From this day forward, Africa will trade gold for gold, not paper for power." The speech hit like a thunderclap. In global markets, chaos erupted. The dollar trembled. European officials called emergency meetings. France accused Burkina Faso of economic sabotage. Trump fired back on social media: "Traoré is a fool. He's destroying Africa's future." But on the streets of Dakar, Lagos, and Kinshasa, crowds cheered. African youth carried signs that read, "We're not fools, we're free." In Washington, Trump's fury boiled over. "He thinks he can stand against the system I built," he roared at his staff. "Tell the Pentagon to draft a response, military, financial, whatever it takes." Yet beneath the anger, there was fear. Analysts warned that Traoré's gold policy could spark a domino effect across Africa. If enough nations joined him, Western leverage could collapse. "He's not just a president," one CIA officer said quietly. "He's a spark, and the world's full of dry grass." That night, as the city of Ouagadougou slept, Traoré stood under the starlit sky, surrounded by the scent of wet earth after rain. His mind was sharp, but his heart was heavy. He knew what came next. The West would not stay silent. And this time, they wouldn't send words, they'd send fire. Still, he whispered to himself, "Let them come. We are no longer their goldmine. We are their reckoning." 3 days later, the storm broke. A leaked U.S. intelligence memo appeared online. It revealed discussions of covert operations to destabilize the Traoré regime. Western media scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. The world saw what Traoré had been warning about: the gold was never the issue, control was. Inside the Burkinabe presidential palace, the mood was tense but resolute. Captain Diarra entered Traoré's office holding the printed memo. "They're planning cyber attacks, funding opposition groups, maybe even mercenaries." Traoré didn't flinch. He set down his pen, looked up, and said, "Then let them waste their gold trying to buy loyalty. They'll find that Africans are no longer for sale." That evening, Traoré called an emergency summit with the Sahel Alliance. Presidents from Mali, Niger, and Guinea joined via encrypted video link. "The United States and its allies will strike economically first," he said, "but our unity is their nightmare. We must prepare for what they fear most, an independent African economy." Guinea's leader spoke up, his voice low but determined. "They underestimate us because they still see slaves, not strategists. Traoré smiled faintly. Then let's teach them strategy. The alliance agreed to a historic move, the creation of a shared gold reserve, the Sahel treasury. No longer would their gold be stored in Western banks. It would remain in Africa, guarded by Africans. The announcement stunned the world. European markets plummeted. American officials called it economic warfare. Trump, pacing in the Oval Office, was livid. "Who does he think he is?" he barked. "I'll show him what happens when you challenge America." He called an emergency press briefing. Cameras clicked as he stormed onto the podium. "If Traoré wants to play games with gold," he shouted, "we'll make him regret it. We own that gold, and we'll get it back." But across the Atlantic, in Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed his people under a darkening sky. "They can threaten, sanction, even invade," he said, his voice rising like thunder. "But the era of taking what's ours is over. Let Trump shout, let the West rage. We'll answer not with fear, but with freedom." The crowd roared. Across Africa, the message spread like wildfire. Posters, songs, even graffiti bore his words: "We'll pay the price, but never the chains." And as night fell, Traoré stood at his balcony, watching torches light the city below. For the first time, he felt the power shift, not in gold or dollars, but in hearts. In the following days, tension escalated into a silent war. Western news anchors called Traoré the man risking Africa's stability. But in African capitals, he was the man restoring Africa's soul. His every speech now echoed from Ghana to Sudan, even schoolchildren knew his name. In Washington, Trump's advisors presented grim data. "Mr. President, African trade with the U.S. is collapsing. Our companies are losing billions. Gold exports are being rerouted through new regional banks." Trump's fist hit the table. "Then we'll crush their economy, freeze their assets." "But sir," one economist warned, "it's already too late. The Sahel treasury is growing, and Russia, China, and the BRICS nations have offered to back it. They're turning gold into a new currency platform." Trump stared at the report, disbelief twisting his face. "So they want to start their own world order? Over my dead body." Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré held a private meeting with his military council. The room was lit only by the soft glow of a single lantern. "They'll try to buy our generals," said Captain Diarra. "They'll send offers, threats, money." Traoré nodded. "Then we must remind our soldiers why we fight. Not for wealth, for dignity." He leaned over the table, pointing to the Sahel map. "Every grain of gold they took was a piece of our ancestors. We are reclaiming them now. Let them call us rebels. History will call us reborn." That same evening, Traoré gave a televised address to his people. His words were fire, each syllable carrying both rage and hope. "When they took our gold, they took our future. But look around, the future stands here. We may not have their bombs, but we have something greater: unity." Crowds erupted in cheers. In the background, chants filled the air: "Africa will never kneel." Across the ocean, Trump sat in silence, watching the footage. His jaw was clenched. His ego bruised. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. A single African soldier-turned-president had flipped the script, and the world was watching. "Prepare a statement," Trump muttered coldly. "If he wants a price, he's about to see what it costs to defy America." He didn't know it yet, but his threat would ignite something far larger than trade. It would awaken a continent's fury that no sanctions could silence. Within a week, the confrontation exploded beyond diplomacy. U.S. forces began training missions in West Africa, thinly veiled operations meant to pressure Traoré's allies. Drones flew near Burkina Faso's borders. Western ambassadors delivered warnings wrapped in smiles. But Traoré was unmoved. He convened a summit of African defense ministers in Bamako, standing before them in his sand-colored uniform. "If they come for one of us," he said firmly, "they come for all of us." His words were met with thunderous applause. In Washington, Trump's aides reported that Burkina Faso had closed 2 U.S.-linked mining companies. He's nationalizing assets, one shouted. Trump leaned back, glaring at the map. Then let's make an example of him. The next morning, global headlines screamed, U.S. freezes Burkina Faso's gold reserves abroad. Overnight, millions vanished from state accounts. For many leaders, it would have been a death blow. But Traoré saw it differently. They've taken numbers, he told his council. We still have the ground, the gold, and the people. That night, he addressed his nation again, this time from a rural village surrounded by miners, farmers, and soldiers. The setting was symbolic. They want to crush us because they fear us, he said, his voice cutting through the night air. They think gold gives them power. But gold came from this soil, our soil. They've forgotten who truly owns it. An old miner stepped forward, his hands trembling but proud. Mr. President, he said, holding up a lump of raw gold, they can freeze banks, but they can't freeze this. The crowd erupted. Across social media, images of that moment went viral, a leader standing shoulder to shoulder with his people, defying an empire with a handful of earth. And in that instant, something shifted. It was no longer just Traoré's battle, it was Africa's. The West expected panic, but instead, they witnessed defiance. Burkina Faso's streets were alive with energy. Citizens formed human chains outside local mines to protect them from foreign interference. Youths painted murals of Traoré, fists raised high above golden soil, with the words, "Our gold, our future." In one interview, a U.S. journalist tried to frame Traoré as reckless. "Aren't you afraid of losing everything?" she asked. Traoré looked into the camera, calm but unyielding. "How can you lose what was never yours to begin with? Fear belongs to those who have something to steal. We already lost it all once, now we're taking it back." The quote spread across the world like wildfire. It trended on X, TikTok, and even Western college campuses where students chanted, "Traoré was right." In response, Trump doubled down. At a rally, he thundered before his supporters, "We built their nations. We paid their bills. And this guy thinks he can outsmart us? Let's see how long he lasts." The crowd cheered, but the energy felt forced. The bravado masked unease. Even his own advisors warned him that the African backlash was growing. Meanwhile, Traoré was already several moves ahead. He reached out to South American and Asian nations to create an alternative gold exchange, one free from Western banks. The message was simple: if gold is power, then power belongs to the producers. In a late-night meeting, Captain Diarra handed him a fresh report. "Our reserves are safe, sir. And the people, they're not afraid anymore." Traoré leaned back, exhaustion mixing with pride. "Good," he said softly. "Because the West only wins when we kneel. But this time, we stand." Outside, chants echoed through the capital, rising with the warm African wind, "The gold returns home." And from that moment, the world began to understand, this wasn't just an economic rebellion. It was a spiritual one. In the weeks that followed, global markets trembled. American economists called it the gold shock. Prices spiked, currencies wavered, and suddenly the nations once ignored by the West were dictating the rhythm of trade. The Sahel treasury became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that Africa's wealth no longer needed Western permission to exist. Inside the Oval Office, Trump's temper was legendary. "He's playing hero while our investors bleed," he barked, pacing like a storm. "Tell the Pentagon to draft contingencies. I want options, sanctions, covert ops, media pressure, everything." But as his fury spread through Washington, the opposite was happening in Africa. In a televised address, Traoré spoke calmly from his office. "They've spent decades teaching us dependency," he said. "Now they fear what happens when we unlearn it." His words rippled across continents. African youth began holding rallies under one banner: "We are the gold." It wasn't about minerals anymore, it was about dignity, about generations reclaiming their worth. Meanwhile, Trump tried a different tactic: propaganda. Western outlets released hit pieces accusing Traoré of corruption and military brutality. Yet the smear campaigns failed. Journalists who visited Burkina Faso returned with stories of farmers earning fair pay, soldiers defending borders with pride, and schools teaching African history for the first time in years. It wasn't the image of a dictator, it was the image of a revolution. During a quiet evening in Ouagadougou, Traoré met with a group of local elders. One of them, an old woman with weathered hands, said softly, "You've reminded us of our ancestors. You've made us walk tall again." Traoré bowed his head respectfully. "Then the gold has already done its job," he said. "It brought back our pride." Outside, fireworks lit up the horizon, not for victory, but for awakening. Washington's patience finally snapped. Trump's administration announced a new wave of sanctions against Burkina Faso, banning trade, freezing transactions, and blacklisting companies linked to the Sahel alliance. It was economic warfare disguised as diplomacy. But Traoré refused to blink. In a live address broadcast across Africa, he stood in front of a massive wall of gold bricks, each one stamped with the Burkinabe emblem. His voice was steady, his eyes fierce. "They call this punishment," he said. "But to punish us, they must first control us. And those days are gone." The image went viral overnight. Hashtags like #AfricaWillNotKneel and #GoldOfFreedom flooded social media. Even Western citizens began questioning their government's actions. "Why fear a nation demanding self-respect?" asked one American journalist on live TV. Trump, fuming, took to the podium again. "We've done everything for them. We've protected them. Fed them. And this is the thanks we get?" His anger filled the air, but something deeper flickered beneath it: insecurity. The world wasn't listening to him anymore. Meanwhile, Traoré's influence reached beyond Africa. Latin American nations sent envoys to study the Sahel treasury model. Asian economists praised his vision. He was no longer seen as a radical, he was becoming a global architect of resistance. That evening, in a quiet meeting with his generals, Captain Diarra showed Traoré the latest reports. "Our gold reserves are untouched. Trade with BRICS nations is expanding. The people are holding strong." Traoré smiled faintly. "Then they underestimated us again," he said. "They thought the fight was for gold. But it was always for respect." He looked out the window, watching children playing in the street below, barefoot, laughing, free. "That," he whispered, "is the treasure they'll never own." The next day, as the sun rose over the Sahel, the world began to understand, this wasn't just Burkina Faso's stand, it was humanity's reminder that dignity can't be bought or stolen. Months later, the tide had completely turned. What began as a standoff between a superpower and a small West African nation had become a movement reshaping global politics. The Gold War, as the media called it, ended not with bombs or treaties, but with silence from Washington. Trump had stopped mentioning Traoré altogether. In Africa, however, his name had become legend. Statues were raised in Ouagadougou, Dakar, and Bamako, not to glorify power, but to honor defiance. Schools taught his speeches as lessons in sovereignty. Farmers, miners, and soldiers wore pins engraved with his most famous words: "We may pay the price, but never the chains." At a United Nations summit months later, Traoré stood before the Assembly of World Leaders. Trump sat only a few rows away, his face unreadable. Cameras flashed as Traoré began to speak, calm yet commanding. "For centuries, you called us resources. For decades, you called us dependent. But today, we call ourselves free. Africa is not asking for permission anymore, we are demanding respect." The hall was silent, electrified. Even those who disagreed couldn't look away. The same leaders who once dismissed him now leaned forward, realizing they were witnessing history. After the speech, as the delegates applauded, Traoré turned toward Trump. Their eyes met, one burning with pride, the other with reluctant recognition. Trump didn't clap, but he didn't look away either. For the first time, he knew, the balance had shifted. That evening, back in Burkina Faso, Traoré walked alone through the presidential gardens. The air was cool, the stars burning like molten gold. He thought of the miners, the children, the mothers who had endured hunger and fear, all for this dream of freedom. He whispered softly to the night, "They said they owned our gold, but it was never about gold. It was about the soul of Africa." And as the wind swept through the trees, carrying his words into the darkness, the world understood, the empire of greed had met its match in the heart of a soldier who refused to kneel.